It's the one big global opinion that really counts as far as India and global growth and all the head and the tailwinds are concerned. Who better than Professor Raghuram Rajan, who joins us right here on ET Now. Thank you very much for being with us. The IMF has cut the global growth forecast but believes India has the potential and the growth will pick up in 2019. We have so far been a one-engine economy. Consumption has been the mainstay. Are you somebody who's going to celebrate the fact that we'll have potential to grow up, or are you a little worried that even that growth is dependent on a benign oil regime which can turn volatile anytime?
Well, there are certainly vulnerabilities. So let's start with cup half full.
Yes.
Yes, it is good to see that growth continues at the 7+ pace. What is worrisome, of course, is some of the underpinnings of that growth. That, as you said, it's largely consumption, but also that it's not creating enough jobs. I mean, one can dispute the jobs figures, but the fact is there are lots of people looking for very few jobs. And so, given that, I think going forward, we have to move it towards a more job-creating economy. Otherwise, all the growth goes for nothing if it doesn't create that form of inclusion, which is good jobs.
Which will mean consumption and investment will have to go hand in hand.
Absolutely. Investment has to pick up. And of course, we also have to prepare for some of the volatility that is going to occur in the world economy. Oil prices are low now. Clearly, if the world slows down, they will continue to remain low. But if there are geopolitical shocks, you could have the combination of low growth and very high oil prices. We have to buffer better. Also, there is worry about the fisc. We have a budget coming up, but we have lots of expenditure plans. And of course, as the CAG has said, the quality of our fiscal consolidation has not been great. There's a lot of off-balance sheet stuff. And so I think looking forward, it is very important we focus on macro stability, even while moving towards a more job-creating economy.
There is a broad consensus of sorts that there could be an agri-relief package in the budget this year. The finance minister has said that markets will understand that this is a rational and not a populist move. Now, to stay on the course of fiscal consolidation, that will have to be breached for a package like this. Do you believe markets will be forgiving?
Well, it depends a little on how it is structured. Because in India, as elsewhere, once something is given, it can't be taken back.
That's right.
So if it is structured in such a way that it substitutes for less efficient forms of giving relief to farmers, I think it could work. If, on the other hand, it is structured as an addition, we really have to think long term when it rolls out how much it will cost. I mean, there are so many things we've added in the last few years which are going to have long term effects. For example, health insurance. For example, the crop insurance that we're putting together. So the reality is the farm sector is not doing well. We do need to think about sensible ways of making it an engine of growth.
Will an income support or an assured sum of, say, 10,000 rupees per family for the land that they have be a sensible measure? I know you're absolutely against farm loan waivers, which destroy credit discipline, which have long-term impact. But do these things you believe are on your recipe list?
Let's be careful. Blanket farm loan waivers don't make sense because they go to the wrong people. There's a lot of expenditure, etc. Specific waivers in case of people who can't pay, just like you do for industrial corporations, make sense. Now, going to the issue of a universal basic income for farmers, again, to the extent it substitutes for more distortionary subsidies, it may make sense. And of course, you want to taper it off as you get to larger and larger farmers. But for that, you need to plan well. You need to identify who is eligible. And of course, there is the question of, does it go to the tenant? Does it go to the owner? What about tenant farmers? What about agricultural labor?
That's right.
Those are, now, agricultural labor, to some extent, Manrega is meant for them. But what about the tenant farmer? How do you deal with them? So these are issues that need to be thought through. And again, as I said, as a substitute, rather than adding yet another layer without trying to refigure the other layers, it makes sense.
I can't not talk about the monetary policy and without getting into the realm of what the MPC needs to do next. But do you believe the stage is set for monetary easing in India? Inflation has been well below the targeted levels of 4%. It's been below 6% for 3 years now. Growth hasn't really picked up. Do you believe there is room for monetary easing?
Well, when you say growth hasn't picked up, we started by saying that this is 7% plus and we should be celebrating. So we really have a sort of schizophrenic view here that sometimes we say growth should be much higher. On the other hand, we say, we beat our chest and say it's wonderful. The reality is that as you push growth higher, we are seeing that we're reaching the limits of our potential. And that is worrisome for inflation. I mean, headline inflation has been really low, partly because of agricultural prices. But the latest reading on core inflation suggests it's quite strong.
Yes.
Now, of course, the RBI has a mandate to focus on headline, but to some extent that was set at a time when, in fact, headline was the real problem. Now, broadly, the RBI has to look at the broader mandate of inflation. That doesn't mean changing the goalposts, but it has to worry about what core inflation means for headline down the line. And that's something that I'm sure the RBI will think about.
So you believe even though CPI may have eased, core inflation is sticky, stubborn at 5.3, 5.6% continues to be a problem. We're also talking at a time when, there are elections to be held in India. Without getting into the political realm of this, what would your assessment be of this government's performance? What would be the big hits according to you and some of the misses that you would rather have not had?
Well, I think that when you look at the government's performance, you have to look certainly at the overall growth regime. You have to look at the distribution of that growth, and this is where the worries about jobs start coming. And it is not just this government; it has been over time. In terms of having the legislative mandate, where are the positives, where are the negatives? The positives, of course, was GST was enacted, the bankruptcy was enacted. The negatives, to some extent, is we have done little on labor flexibility, which means sort of bolstering contract labor while giving employers some flexibility. There's a win-win to be had. We haven't moved in that direction. The other big, I think, lacuna is on land acquisition. How can we speed up land acquisition using the best practices across the states? Because clearly one of the roadblocks in terms of infrastructure rollout is that. And of course, that leads to the third problem, which is our infrastructure rollout has been quite slow. And really to create jobs, especially for people leaving agriculture, infrastructure has to be central. So to some extent, I think both in terms of legislative activity in these areas, as well as improving the pace of growth, I think there's more can be done.
No, I agree with you. I mean, people who are coming out of agriculture will need jobs, and those jobs alone can be created by infrastructure, construction and all of that. But in some sense, are you then a little concerned that if a government with this brute majority couldn't do land and labor, who could?
Well, I think
and is that going to be politically so unpalatable that we'll perhaps not see those happen?
Well, this is the difficulty of political leadership. It is how to build a consensus about these ways of reform. Many of us now have read that wonderful book about how Narasimha Rao managed those reforms from behind the scenes along with Dr. Manmohan Singh. And we need something like that somehow we need to push ahead on reforms. We need a second generation of reforms. And that needs both political will at the top as well as implementation. And I think for this, we have to move towards a more decentralized structure of government. An overly centralized structure of government may offer leadership, but may not offer the ability to implement. And one of the lacunae we've seen over the last few years is that the policy plans at the top tend to remain that. They don't get translated into implementation.
And execution and implementation is the key for a success of any reform. You've underlined some of the vulnerabilities for India and fault lines, if I may borrow your phrase, but in an election year, are elections the biggest uncertainty for the economic landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I would see elections as both, creating some degree of uncertainty about what the political establishment will be. But I would also take comfort from the previous history of Indian elections, that we've consistently brought in governments that have broadly stuck on the course of reforms. Some have moved more, some have moved less, but broadly the direction has been right. Second, I think we have to put a lot of faith in our electorate, which has sent the right message time and again. And I think in this time, this elections, as a citizen of India as opposed to an economist, I would say the three big issues on the economic front, again, at the risk of repeating, jobs. I think on the country front, I think the issue of where we go as a country, how tolerant we are of different views of minorities, I think this is an important turning point for India, and we get to choose at this point. And the third issue I would say that has been raised, and certainly is a concern, is how we protect our institutions. Whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's the Election Commission, whether it's the RBI, those are issues that come up.
I will just talk about institutions in a bit, but markets are typically very wary of fractured mandates. They hate coalitions. Our history, though, has proven otherwise. I mean, the reform trajectory has been maintained. So, two questions there. Are you somebody who varies a coalition as well? And the other question is, do you believe, irrespective of the political combination that comes to power, the trajectory on reforms is here to stay?
Well, I think there will be variation depending on the combination that comes to power. And sometimes centralized governments with one strong party tend to have more of a mandate, tend to be able to move. But we've also seen examples where they haven't moved very much. We've also seen examples of coalitions that have in fact moved considerably. So I would say the jury is still out. Some of our greatest reforms were under a government that basically hung on by the skin of its teeth to a majority. So I think we have to wait and see. My sense is the pressure from people now for change is increasing, and that any government will have to respond to that.
And you believe change on the three things that you spoke about: institutions, jobs, and of course the level of tolerance in the country.
Exactly.
The one point that I wanted to also speak to you about is a lot of people believe economic reforms are always difficult to sell. Is that necessarily true? Because no true reformist prime minister in India has been voted back to power. Why is that so?
Well, I think the real issue is that any reform tends to affect vested interests. And they coalesce very fast. And then they push against the reforms as part of a broader agenda while singling out certain downsides of those reforms. So in public opinion, it sometimes is a constant battle to defend the reforms that you're doing and explain why it's good for the broader masses. Now that's true leadership. Now it is, I think, something that we need. It is something that has to be sold. I'm not a great believer in reform by stealth, though I know we have done a lot in that way. That if you have a frank conversation with the people, a lot can be sold. Now, we have to see.
So is creative incrementalism then here to stay as far as India's reform agenda is concerned? Because that perhaps is easier, politically more palatable. And also the second question is that has stigmatized capitalism, your good friend Arvind Subramanian talks about this, has that taken a toll on economic decision making in India? The perception management?
Well, historically, we have had an excessive amount of favors done for a few segments of the population. And I think, it is good for a government to be wary about that. But that said, capitalism is changing in India also. We have a lot of self-made people who have pulled themselves up, not through favors, but by actually producing a better product. Example, Bharat Forge, Mahindra makes good products and so on. There are lots of these big names that have done good things. So in that sense, I think it's a process by which we slowly come out. Today, if we can implement the bankruptcy code and we finally essentially reach closure on some of these, it will send a message that even the most powerful are not immune to the system and will in fact lose their firms if they mismanage them. So I think it is a process by which we steadily send the message: we want good capitalists, we're not against capitalism, we want them to create jobs, but if you want to misuse the system, there is the door for you.
Fair point indeed. And like you said, I think just again borrowing a thought from what you've espoused in public, saying debt cannot be treated as equity, and Indian promoters have done that for far too long. You started really the war against NPAs. Are you satisfied with, I'm not so sure if it's really come to its fag end, but are you satisfied with how it's progressed?
Well,
or has it been frustrating to see?
In India, you can never be satisfied with the pace of progress. You always want it to go faster. But we have to live with what we have. And to some extent, I think it's very important to build the institutions under the bankruptcy code so that going forward, it will work really effectively. There is a backlog, of course, which has built up in the time that before it was set up. And so there will be some shortcuts initially. But going forward, we need a reliable system. We need a system which is not overwhelmed. And I hope we are in the process of creating that. And that will allow debt to actually be debt in this country.
Fair point. Few last closing questions, Dr. Rajan, and I think one of them has to be on the institutional independence that you spoke about, institutional autonomy, and any good economy has to be judged by the independence of its institutions. Some amount of tension is hardwired in the RBI government relationship, but things really went downhill. There was public name calling, there were pot shots taken at each other, and eventually an RBI governor had to resign. As somebody who headed that institution at one point in time, what was going through your mind when that was happening?
Look, the reality is, as you said, there's some constructive tension built into the relationship. And it is important for all sides to respect that constructive tension. And this means a constant process of dialogue, of backroom dialogue that takes place. Now, I think going forward, it is time that we sort of say that on occasion, this kind of dialogue can break down. And in that situation, how do we protect the relative independence of both parties? And we have to judge. Of course, the RBI works as an entity of the administration and works under the government, given the marching orders that the government has seen fit to enshrine in its mandate. But given that mandate, it should have the operational freedom to carry out that mandate. Now, earlier this was based on a kind of informal consensus. And the question we have to ask ourselves is it time to enshrine this in a much more formal consensus? Because otherwise it keeps getting eroded in one way or the other. And of course, with the wrong kinds of personalities at play, it could become problematic. We are becoming a middle-income economy. We have to ensure that our institutions are really middle-income institutions, which means we have to strengthen them where necessary.
Would you then recommend, will your policy prescription to that be a change in the RBI Act that talks about what happens during a breakdown in conversation? Because I think the one thing that a lot of people point out is, was this a mere personality clash? Because we've got a new incumbent now. It looks like the channels of communication are open. It's not as if he's written off an entire 3.6 lakh crore worth of RBI's money to the government. And still there seems to be some semblance of sanity.
Look, I wasn't in the middle of those discussions, so I don't know how much was personalities and how much was other stuff. And I do agree that we should not reform just based on specific personalities. But in a sense, the relationship between institutions should not come down to personalities. It shouldn't be up to the personalities to manage. As we become more developed, we have to manage the relationships so that it survives different personalities. And that is why I think formalizing some of the structures makes sense, so that they're not constantly eroded. For example, the position of the RBI governor, what level he or she occupies in the hierarchy, is completely left up to the spur of the moment. Right. Some secretaries pretend that they're above the RBI governor, and the hierarchy keeps getting blurred. And I think it is time that we sort of made clear what that position is and why that position exists. And similarly for the other regulators, it's not just about the RBI.
I think experts have already put out there that RBI governor in a lot of ways is at par with the finance minister, because he's doing the monetary management and the other one is doing the fiscal management. Before I let you go,
well,
I'm not
going to... I would just say that I think it would be appropriate for the RBI governor to be below the finance minister, but typically above the bureaucracy, because it is a position that the bureaucracy attains after many years in the bureaucracy, and it is not appropriate that the RBI governor be dictated to by a secretary in the government.
Fair point indeed. Last question, and I don't want to add fuel to fire. I don't want to add to the speculation, but there are speculations that you've been approached by political parties for political manifestos and things like that. I don't want to get into the realm of this. I'd like it if you can confirm or deny. But on a larger question, if this were to be a fractured mandate in 2019 and to put things together, if you were approached, will you be open to a position back in India?
Well, first, that is a speculative question, and I don't answer them. What is true is that a bunch of economists and I have put out some ideas that up to people to take, and we've been open to talking to anybody who wants to talk to us, and we've been talking to political leaders of different kinds. In fact, here I was supposed to be on a panel with with Mr. Chandrababu Naidu. Unfortunately, he could not come. But the idea is really to do what is right for India, and if we can help in any way in giving advice, I think it is very important.
It will be a sane mind that will welcome and advise, and an insane one that you have said. But thank you very much for speaking to us right here in Davos.